Well, hello everyone. I'm the director for our New Zealand registered not-for-profit charitable educational trust called Common Knowledge. I put 25 years of work into a charitable trust when I immigrated to New Zealand in the 90s. And what I put into the trust was a concept that hundreds of expectant mothers and fathers developed in the 1970s and the skills that they developed. So the concept is separate from the skills. So the concept is that when you're pregnant, it's natural and normal to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills, and then use those skills to work through your baby's birth journey. Birthing Better skills are one such method. There are other such methods. So we're not, as a trust, necessarily promoting our skills-based method. We certainly know why the skills are different, but we are promoting this very broad concept for all expectant parents, because 100% of pregnant women will give birth one way or another. And each one of us as a pregnant woman has to do the activity of birthing our baby, no matter what. And because it's an activity, and because humans thrive on being skilled, fathers and mothers developed skills to do that activity. And as I said, there are other skills-based methods. Those were developed to do the activity as well. And so when you're pregnant, it just should be normal and natural for you to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills and use them to work through your baby's birth journey. And that's part of the hitch. And the hitch is that most of the birth skills are targeted for low-risk women who want to achieve a natural birth. And the conversation around childbirth since the 1980s has been dominated and led by natural birth advocates. And it was problematic back then, and it's become increasingly problematic since. So let me explain something to you of what I have learned over the years. Someone has an idea, right? You have an idea. And when you have that idea, you're thinking forward that that idea, if it was put into place, would achieve results, or it has goals. So there's an idea, and that idea in childbirth is that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care. But even if we leave that part out and just go, pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events, all of us would say, that's right. And we would understand what the word pregnancy means, because we're either pregnant or we're not. We'd understand what birth means, because 100% of pregnant women will give birth one way or another. The word we don't understand is what normal means. And if you look it up in a dictionary, it has a variety of meanings. So how is it actually used when you have natural birth advocates or who want more normal births? Go look at the dictionary and ask yourself, what's the meaning of it? And really what they want is a birth that has no medical interventions. And as I've said in others of the video, that word intervention also, if you look it up in a dictionary and find out what the meaning is, has different meanings. And when I gave birth in 1970, that wasn't a word we used because we didn't have any choices. So they were called assessments, monitoring procedures. Another way to describe those things are evidence-based practice. We hear a lot of that. Standards of care, we hear that. Guidelines to practice, practice protocols. So we know that from the delivery of service, a hospital, a birth center, a midwife, an obstetrician, labor and delivery nurse, any of the birth workers, that they have, if they are part of a professional body, that professional body will expect of them to do certain things. And why do they do those things? They do those things to try to safeguard the health and well-being of ourselves and of our babies. And we may not like what the medical profession does, and you can choose not to go to the hospital. If you have a risk or problems, you can choose not to get help. The same way if you have a heart attack or you have a stroke or your kid falls off the roof or you get into a fender bender in your car, you can choose not to have medical care. And birth's no different. You can just choose not to have any assessments, monitoring procedures. You just don't go into any place where those things are done. Because as soon as you step foot into where they do those things, they do those things. And to some degree, they're okay with you saying no. And to other degrees, they get very frustrated because they don't know why you're there if you want to just say no to everything that they're trying to do to safeguard the health and well-being of your baby. So when natural birth advocates really got globalized in the 80s, and I had already been involved in the birth conversation for 10 years, then the reality was I was listening to a change of trends, to a change in the childbirth conversation, that when I gave birth in 1970, the first childbirth preparation classes were being taught, and that was Lamaze and Bradley method in New Zealand, Grantley Dick Reed. 3 obstetricians who wanted to separate low-risk women from high-risk women. So they were saying low-risk women should be able to do birth without any medical care. And that's the assumption that someone who is low risk in pregnancy, that their baby doesn't have a problem, or that birth doesn't become problematic. And there is not a correlation between those things. You might want there to be, but there's not a correlation, nor is there any sort of stories by women about that. Lots of women, I mean, over the 50 years, the biggest group are pregnancy yoga teachers, who many of them end up with cesareans. And why? Because external yoga, stretching, has nothing to do with the internal tension, which is what your baby needs you to reduce. So when I gave birth in 1970, we had assessments, monitoring procedures, ones that are different than yours because the maternity system wasn't as sophisticated. They were dealing with a different viewpoint. And yet, in my generation, multiple millions of women and men in the United States went into birth using some form of skills. So what we did was to reduce our own suffering. We coped better with the natural and normal occurring pain of contractions. And most of us were laboring because the maternity system wasn't that sophisticated. So 95% of us were laboring whether we had risks or not, because risks were considered to be normal. That's why you have to look up in the dictionary what the word normal means. So when risks are normal and you hear the term natural birth or that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events, how do those interface, or how do they conflict with one another? So it was only in the 80s when I gave birth last that the natural birth movement, the global movement, began to label all assessments, monitoring procedures as being interventions. And the interventions have 2 things, right? So, for example, what's an intervention for somebody with substance abuse? You've heard that word. What's an intervention if you want to climb up a ladder onto your roof? What are the things that you'd put in place to try to stop the person up on the roof from falling off and breaking a limb? That's an intervention. So interventions can be good, and that's what assessments, monitoring, and procedures were, though we didn't like them, is that they were interventions that were trying to assess, monitor, and some procedures to safeguard the health and well-being of ourselves and our babies. However, the natural birth movement used that word to say that they're unnecessary and imposed on women, which set up the choice-based system of childbirth, the trend that you're in now. You're told that you have the right to tell your birth professionals the type of birth you want. The implication is you know what you want. But that comes into conflict with the fact that there's no way to know what your birth's going to be like. And babies don't come to plan. So what you want and what you have can be vastly different. So it becomes very difficult for women to decide what they want and don't want before birth, because as birth unfolds, situations change. And what becomes complicated is if you've said no to pain relief and you've told your partner, I do not want to use an epidural. I don't want pain relief. I just want to have a natural birth. I don't want to have an epidural. I want natural birth, because an epidural is an intervention. It's imposed on women. It's unnecessary. I just want to do this naturally. Yet if you lack skills and labor contractions get intense and you find yourself suffering and overwhelmed, and then saying to the care providers and your partner, I want an epidural, and your partner says to you, but you said you didn't want one. And your response is, you're not doing this. You don't know how I feel. This is so painful. Oh no, another one's coming, right? So as a partner, you give in because you get nervous and anxious. You don't want your partner to suffer, and you're not certain that the suffering isn't connected to a problem. So she has an epidural. Whether it works well or not, who knows? Let's just assume it works well. She gives birth vaginally, and 18 months later, she's pissed off at you because you didn't have the skills to help her get through labor, and you didn't remind her that 18 months later, she might not have been pleased at changing her choices. So this is why after COVID came out, I've decided that I needed to start to speak out again. It's hard to get online and talk about issues, particularly when the conversation is led by the natural birth movement, because they do not want to hear you. They didn't want to hear me in the 70s. They didn't want to hear me in the 80s and the 90s and 2000s. And they don't really want to hear me now. But you might want to hear me. You might be pregnant, or you might be a partner of a pregnant woman. And this is where ideas matter. So if the idea is that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events, and we accept that, then we're asking, okay, so birth, what are we doing about that? And the words attached to that idea presently is make a birth plan. Do the research about the interventions and tell your birth professional what you want and don't want. Make a birth plan. And those are words and actions. And they sit into a system, and to some degree policies, in which birth professionals are trying to understand what choices you're making. But because they've been in a lot of births, there's a part of them as human beings that know that babies don't come to plan, and there's no way to know what your birth's going to be like. And you may not have the birth you want. So what if we think of it differently? What if we think, still using pregnancy and childbirth or normal life events, and then we think it's an activity that each woman is doing with her baby, no matter where she births, or who's present, or her circumstances, her choice, or lack of choices, change of choices, or what happens to her around her? What if we have this idea that it's an activity, and we express it as an activity, and then the actions are that you learn skills to do this activity, and the other actions are that you use the skills to do this activity, you still may end up with assessments, monitoring, and procedures, or interventions as they're called. They may be standards of care, and you may feel that they're imposed on you, and you may feel that they're unnecessary. However, if you've approached birth from that viewpoint, that it's an activity and you should self-learn skills and use skills, then even if your birth plans change, you have skills to keep doing the activity. And that's what our trust, and that's what the hundreds of fathers and mothers who develop the Birthing Better skills, why they developed the concept. Because they each of us, we care about our birth. You're sitting there listening to me now. You can care one iota about my birth, right? And I don't really care about your birth. Doesn't mean I want you to suffer. Doesn't mean I don't want you to have an orgasmic birth. It's just not where we really socially mix. It's only within this conversation around pregnancy and childbirth where we talk about birth. And this is what our trust tries to do. We're now trying to talk about deconfusing the childbirth conversation and setting things right. Because we had an opportunity in my generation. We almost, with those 3 obstetricians, they almost, but they didn't, almost said 100% of pregnant women will give birth, and 100% of pregnant women should learn skills and then use their skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. If for no other goal than for women to feel more in control. Would that do good? Would that be good? Well, yes, it would be good because often women don't feel in control. And if we can use skills to work through the activity of birthing our baby and we can feel in control even though we don't always like what's going on to us or around us, then we have more empowered births for all births. And so today we're going to talk a bit more about the interventions. This list in this 5-part series of 6 interventions in each part of the series comes from my teaching Strengthening the Partnership workshops to midwives in New Zealand. They're very strong advocates that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events, and they tag on the rest of it that rarely require medical care. Yet they tend to 98% of the expectant families in New Zealand and have since 1990. And while it's a wonderful system, it's a system that fails because the partnership model is based on women's choices and not on women and men self-learning skills and using skills to work through their baby's birth. That lack of strength within the partnership model was when I first got there and remains today stark because babies do not come to plan. And the care providers are advocating for natural childbirth. And they're serving almost the entire population. And the cesarean rate has more than doubled to about 28% under midwifery care who are advocating for more natural births. And a large part of this has to do with the fact that if you want more natural births, if you want less medical care, then doing this activity should be highly skilled. And if you have a highly skilled birthing population and you overlay it with assessments and monitoring procedures, that should not make women and men feel as though their birth has been ripped off from them. Because when we connect the idea of natural birth to no medical assessments, monitoring procedures, and implying that all of them are interventions and all of those are imposed on women and women should be saying no to them, then we are setting ourselves up as women to fail. And this is what we've seen for 40 years, even before the New Zealand midwifery of care got put in place. We were seeing it. It's the increase of shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration. And that has to change, and it changes by changing what we're thinking, our ideas, and our words and our actions. So we want to bring skills into the conversation. We want all of you to be skilled because this is your baby's birth. You got pregnant to have a baby, not to have a type of birth. And you can use skills to work through whatever birth unfolds, from driving to the hospital, being prepped, and having a cesarean. Every time you breathe in and breathe out, you can use breathing skills and relaxation skills, communication skills with your partner. If you're having very intense contractions, using skills to stay on top and feel in control, and with a skilled partner, helps you work through those 5 phases of contractions that nobody's paying attention to, because either contractions are not painful or they're very painful because we lack skills. So the unpainful contractions we cope with, and the very painful ones we suffer. And then we seek out or are offered help, assessments, monitoring procedures. And one of them is epidurals or pain relief. So today we're going to talk about, this comes from a list that midwives gathered in these workshops. They want more natural births, and they believe that what's stopping them is interventions. And so they made a list, and there were 30. And so we're going to talk about it. So manipulating positions. That's very interesting, because when I gave birth, you lay on your back with your feet up. And I'd like you to do that at some point. Lie on your back with your feet up in stirrups. How open are you down there? 99.9999999% of us are very open. We may not be in a gravity position, but the area that our baby needs to come out of is very open. So now get into a semi-recumbent position, which was the position that birth advocates advocated for to get women out of lying on their back, feet in stirrups. You sit back on your sacrum, you put your knees up on the floor. Feel how that closes the space. Your upper body's more in gravity, but feel how it closes the space. So we as women are advocating that we get into a gravity position that closes off the area that our baby needs to come out of. So go back to lying on your back, feet up in stirrups. Go on, go do that. Okay? Feel how open you are, and feel how the muscles around the back of your legs and your butt and around your tailbone and between your sit bones feel. Just feel what they feel like. Because if you're giving birth, you need to know this. This is a skill. This is feeling what down there feels like and what your baby needs to navigate. Now, you're going to sit there and thinking that I advocate for lying on your back with feet up stirrups. No, of course not, right? You want to be in a gravity plus position, and you want to be open down there. Both. It's not an either or. So go from lying on your back with feet in stirrups. You know what it's like to be in a semi-recumbent position. You know that closes you off. So just get up and stand up and see how that changes it. It closes you. So take one step forward. Feel what happens in your body. All those muscles down there have to work because we're now being mobile. For some babies, standing and walking, for many babies, being in a semi-recumbent position hinders the birth. It all depends on how much space you have inside and how open you are down there. This big object can navigate down through and out your body. So when I hear birth advocates, whether they're midwives or consumers, saying that manipulating positions is an intervention that's imposed on women, they have advocacy for birth positions. One is a semi-recumbent position. Another one is hands and knees. So get on your hands and knees and feel how you feel down there. But you need to recognize that it's only your thighs and your arms that are upright. You're lying on your belly, and that impacts your baby. Your baby falls to the floor, and that can deflex the baby's head or deflex the body if it's breech. That can hinder a birth. So when this was brought up in this list of 30 things, it's always from the viewpoint that the medical profession, is telling you what to do with positions, but somehow natural birth advocates or midwives, when they're advocating for positions, they somehow know what's right. And this is part of the confusion in childbirth. They're not right, you're pregnant. You need to know what positions are open for you And you also need to know whether the position you're in is a position your baby likes. And this then goes back to the skills that Birthing Better developed, and that's why we know that the skills are different than other systems, because we, over time, realized that every contraction had 5 phases, and that a progressive labor always had a peak in every contraction, and a labor that was stalled or that was going to go on had a plateau instead of a peak. And a large part of that had to do with the positions that a woman was in. Because if the baby can't navigate down through and out your body in whatever posture or position you're in, then you're in the wrong one for your baby. So let's move on to ultrasounds. Never understood exactly. Ultrasounds weren't around when I gave birth in 1970. I've never understood why ultrasounds were considered to be an imposed intervention on people. Actually, most pregnant women scarf them up. They love them, right? And they're informative. Do I think they're right or wrong? I don't care. I'm a director of a trust. Your birth is not my business, and I don't have a value. But when birth professionals or birth advocates treat that as an intervention, and you're pregnant, and let's say you are interested in having natural birth, and you run across a commentary about the pros and cons of an ultrasound, then you get dragged into this crazy conversation. Why do you want an ultrasound? And if you want one, have one. Right? And if you want 10 of them and you can afford them or the government will pay for them, have them. Right? Because part of the problem with the childbirth conversation is what I call the Nani Nana that women do to each other. It became really apparent even before the natural birth global conversation started. It started with a wonderful magazine that came out of Canada. And it was a conversation of, do you get up at night to breastfeed your children, or sleep and just let them cry and let them sleep through the night? I'll tell you, women were crazy with each other, both ways. The women who got up all the time felt that they were doing it right and that everybody else was doing it wrong. And the women who trained their kids to sleep through the night thought they were doing it right, and people who were getting up 6 or 7 times at night were crazy, right? We do this to each other as women. The natural birth movement is a women's led movement, and it has made us crazy, all the way down to the level of our family. I can't tell you how many thousands of women I have heard say, I had natural birth, my sister had a cesarean. Or this one, he was my cesarean, she was my home birth. It's horrible. Kids don't give a damn. So not being able to eat or drink. When I gave birth, I couldn't eat or drink. And there was a reason, because they gave you a general anesthetic if you needed a cesarean, right? That really bothered me back then. And it bothers me now, right? So that's one of the ones that I absolutely firmly agree with. Women should be able to eat or drink. And yet I have talked to many, many, many women who have eaten things as they were going into labor and then found that they vomited it up, and they found that unpleasant. So really what we ended up with was, eating things that you could vomit up without it being beans and rice, if possible. And drinking was very important, particularly oral rehydration, slightly salty, slightly sweet. Because if you have an IV, that's what they're giving you, isn't it? So when you're told not to eat or drink, you find out the reason why. If you think you're going to have surgery, now it's an epidural, so they're not as concerned, but they prefer you to have an empty stomach. So think about that. Not respecting women's choices. When this started to be advocated in the 80s, this is just another example of where the conversation was crazy. We're not professionals. For instance, we drive a car. We take our cars to mechanics. We do not tell our mechanics how to fix our cars. If we have a health issue, we go to professionals. If you don't want to go to a professional, that's your business and that's your choice. However, if you go to the professional, health professional, and then you spend all your time arguing with them, then it's very difficult to have any kind of a relationship with them. And when women make choices in childbirth, they are often making choices based on ideology. And statistics are a very funny thing. So I hear it all the time. Evidence-based practice, right? There's no evidence that X, Y, and Z. But if you are one of those statistics where there's a problem, you are one of those statistics. And if you're one of those statistics that isn't a problem, you're not one. And it's hard to determine which way you're going to fall. The best thing that Birthing Better Families did was to get more realistic about this word risk, because we were all having a labor, risks or not, because they were normal and natural. So what we realized, because there are not infinite risks around pregnancy and childbirth, but there are a lot of them. And what we discovered, because many of the initial hundreds of families that developed this were considered to be medically high risk. And it's not often just one risk, it's often a handful of risks. And what we learned from that is that very few risks actually become problems. And extremely few become tragedies, which is comforting, except you don't know. So everybody's assuming that the risks are going to become tragedies. However, when we became skilled and we paid attention and we focused on doing the activity of birthing our babies, and we focused on our individual risks if they were known, rather than saying, if there's a problem, then what? And what we did was to pay attention. And if we felt we were having a problem or our baby was having a problem, we would inform people. And when we worked with birth professionals who wanted to do assessments, monitoring procedures, and we wanted not necessarily to have all of those, and we had skills, and we were behaving in a way that looked like we were coping well and could talk to them, and everything looked okay, they were all very happy to let us continue to do whatever we were doing. On an individual basis, if their assessments, monitoring procedures are showing that things are well and we're coping well and being in control and we feel things are well, no matter the number of risks, we just kept going. If something changed, we dealt with it at a time. So it wasn't based on ideology. This statement, not respecting women's choices, is based on women having an ideology, paying no attention to anything, and not necessarily behaving like they're in control. But somehow, birth providers are supposed to give women the birth they want. And I recently heard a woman obstetrician say the same thing. It's a woman's body, it's her crotch, and she should get the birth that she wants. And she should demand of her birth professionals that they do everything in their power to give her the birth she wants. And there was not one mention by that woman obstetrician that we had any responsibility to become skilled to try to have an effective, efficient birth. And that's where this whole thing falls apart. Standards of care. So let me just tell you where this started to fall apart for me. In the 70s, every state in the United States had outlawed midwifery in the 50s. So there were no legal midwives. They weren't integrated into the maternity system like in most countries as nurse midwives. There just were no midwives. But of course, there were lay midwives, and there were Vietnam paramedics that came back and did births, and obstetricians and labor and delivery nurses and stuff that did births, if they did them. But what I saw was lay midwives often carried more equipment with them than you'd see if you went to the hospital. And I thought, well, that's weird, right? If you think childbirth is so normal, why are you bringing that? And when I got to New Zealand, because I didn't know there was a midwifery model of care when I immigrated, I found out instantaneously. Their not their logo thing, but their verbal logo is that pregnancy, childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care. And if you live by that philosophy, why do you have a midwifery profession that sets up a 4-year training program for you? That doesn't make sense. And it makes less sense if you go one step further and say, okay, midwives are becoming skilled just in case. Why in their partnership don't they believe that women should be skilled to work through the activity of birthing their baby? And they don't believe that because of the ideology in natural birth is that somehow it's normal and natural, meaning it's good, it's easy, it's doable, has a good outcome, it's a nothing burger, and women should just be left alone, as a famous author said, and midwives should sit in the corner and knit. And so in this partnership, midwives have gone to school for 4 years, they break their back, they give you 24/7 care, they attend to every single one of your needs, and they have no expectation of you. It's not workable, and it's not sensible, and it makes no sense, not even common sense. Giving birth is an activity. We have to do it. It's infrequent, it's a one-off, but it's an activity. And we should have skills. The idea, it's normal and natural for us to learn skills when we're pregnant and use those skills to work through the activity of our baby. It should just be a societal message. You should give it to everybody, and everybody should give it to everybody else. And every birth professional should be telling their clients, I respect your choices, and you have to do this activity. So here's a handout of the skills-based methods. I know, pick one, 24 weeks. We're going to list your skills every time you come to see me. And then at the birth, if your birth unfolds the way you want, yippee. If it doesn't, you'll be included in decision-making. And if you look like you're coping, we'll praise you for using your skills. And if you look overwhelmed, we'll encourage you to use your skills. Why? Because this is your baby's birth. And it's an activity you're doing. So if we have no standards of care around maternity, we have no assessments, no monitoring procedures, then basically you're taking one element of life in the modern world, which is one-off, infrequent, can't be replayed, life-transforming, and you're saying to women, this one aspect of your life, you don't need any doctor or any assessments, or any monitoring, any procedures. Pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care. Don't we all agree on that? And the answer is, nah. We understand it, but it doesn't make sense. You are not going to take modern women and have them give birth outside the context of modern society. And I want to tell you, I have seen lots and lots of birth professionals. I've never seen anybody do anything to intentionally harm a woman. I've seen crazy stuff. But I can honestly tell you that even midwives who are direct entry trained and who do not consider themselves medical, they are all doing assessments, monitoring, and procedures on their clients. So somehow, in one of the other talks, a vaginal exam was not okay, but they do vaginal exams. And when they don't do vaginal exams, there's always that risk, and it's not a tiny risk, and it does lead to a problem, rarely leads to a tragedy, and that is that women begin to push before they're fully dilated because nobody's checked. Now, what's the solution? I can check myself. You just need to know how. So we have caring, women who work as midwives in a country who are in a partnership making a list of what they want their clients to avoid in order to achieve this professional belief around birth. And that's just too hard. And it occurs all around the world with every woman. Right? It doesn't have to be in the midwifery model of care. This is a problem. The conversation is now global, and there is a very pro-natural birth, very anti-medical, a belief that they're imposing things on us. Women who are having these things done to and around them, who can be very ideologically committed. And this is why we have so much shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and birth trauma. And we can change that. How? What did I say earlier? We can change the societal message, the idea and the words and the action, and just say it's an activity. We should all self-learn skills and use the skills to birth our baby in and around all of the health care that we have or don't have. So the last one is telling a woman to push. So remember we had you lie down on your back with your feet up in stirrups and feel how open you are? And then we had you get into a semi-recumbent position with your knees bent and your feet on, and you felt the difference, that sitting back on your sacrum closed you. That change occurred between my first child and my last child. And Lamaze was very much into, it's a childbirth skill, put your chin to, take a deep breath, put your chin to your chest, and push. Right? Fathers were considered to be birth coaches. When the choice-based system came in, fathers were demoted from coaches to support people. So they should just support women's choices and just be there and not tell women what to do, because women somehow instinctively know how to birth. And so women should be left alone to discover birth. 100% of pregnant women are going to get through birth one way or another. But throughout the world and throughout time, the biggest problem in childbirth was women suffering. It had nothing to do with having a problem or a risk or a tragedy. They just suffered because they didn't have skills to deal with the natural occurring pain of contractions. So, do women need to be told to push? The natural birth movement believes that all women will have a spontaneous urge to push at the right time, and that's just not accurate. Some women don't have a spontaneous urge to push, and that's often due to the internal tension in her body or the position she's in. Sometimes the contractions, the pushing contractions, are profoundly delayed between one and the other because the baby doesn't like the position the woman's in, or she has internal tension that she doesn't know about. Did we take a deep breath, drop your chin to your chest and push? No, because if you do that now, you can just all the energy up here. You don't want the energy here, you want it down there. So actually, whether you take a deep breath or not, opening your mouth, dropping your head slightly back and going, is better because you can focus the energy down rather than up. That's why women used to burst blood vessels in their eyes, because they pushed the energy up. So I want to come to the end of this. I've got one more topic within this for the last of the 30. Can you see what our trust is trying to say? Hope so. Can you pass on this new childbirth trend? We just should all learn skills and use skills to birth our baby. We don't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be a natural birth. It can be any birth, anywhere, with anybody there. We don't have to like it. We have to do it. And when we do it with skills, we always, without exception, know we're using skills no matter how imperfectly, and we always birth better because we know that. And that's important. That is important to us, to our children, to our partners, to our families, to our societies. So pass the message on. See you later. Bye-bye.